Good morning, everyone.
I hear you. Can you hear
Good
me?
morning, everyone. We'll be starting the webinar by 11:05. It's just in about a minute. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second detailed webinar series themed Mobilizing Finance for Nigeria's Infrastructure Development. My name is Chizota Makwiru, and I'm an associate in Detailed Commercial Solicitors in the Finance and Capital Markets team. Detail is distinct as Nigeria's first commercial law that exclusively specializes in non-courtroom practice, and our work cuts across corporate and commercial, energy, power and infrastructure, finance and capital markets, legal tax advisory, real estate and construction, and technology and digital economy. This webinar is being brought to you by our finance and capital markets team. So I'll be one of your moderators for today, and I'll start off by setting the tone for our deliberations, after which we'll have a presentation by John from Ernst & Young, and we'll move on to the panel sessions for the day. So I'll start by setting the tone by giving an overview of the legal and regulatory framework for infrastructure financing in Nigeria. The backbone of any national economy is the stock of its infrastructure. Infrastructure has a major impact on the cost of transportation, on the ease of communication, energy supply and exports, and the production of goods and supply of services. It also has a significant impact on the socio-economic development in Nigeria, which includes education, healthcare, and employment in Nigeria. So first in the lineup of the laws we'll be looking at is the National Infrastructure Integrated Master Plan. The master plan was first released in 2014 by the federal government and was revised in 2020. It provides a roadmap for over the next 22 years for building a world-class infrastructure that will guarantee sustainable economic growth in Nigeria. One of its key objectives is to promote private sector participation in infrastructure projects in Nigeria. Now, in order to unlock this private sector participation, there's some very critical issues that Nigeria will need to address. First of which is government rules and regulations. It's very key that there's established a clear legal and regulatory framework for private sector financing in Nigeria. Another key issue is fiscal incentives. The private sector should be offered business and fiscal incentives, which include tax holidays, tax credits, and import duty exemptions, as well as things like granting them pioneer status. Another key issue is political and cost risks. It's important that the private sector is assured of policy consistency even as governments transition from one to the other, and that corruption is eliminated in Nigeria. It's also key to develop the capabilities in managing PPPs. This simply means that the private sector itself must develop initiatives that will allow them carry out the projects, and also have in-house teams in the MDAs that will implement these projects on their end. Lastly, and very key to this webinar, is access to capital. It's important that we establish long-term financing and refinancing strategies for viable projects, particularly in the early stages. This webinar will focus on these sort of initiatives that will drive access to capital by the private sector in this infrastructure projects. Now, the following laws I'll be considering will also give room to accessing this capital that we're talking about. One of these laws is the Infrastructure Act. This act creates a framework for PPPs for financing, construction, operation, and maintenance of infrastructure projects. It also establishes the ICRC, who will ensure compliance with the act and its efficient execution. The ICRC, in carrying out its functions, is allowed to make laws and regulations that will enable it to carry out its functions efficiently. We also have the set rules on infrastructure funds, and this applies to funds that are constituted as collective investment schemes. Infrastructure funds are simply specialized funds or schemes that primarily invest in securities or securitized debt instruments of a number of entities, and this includes infrastructure companies, infrastructure projects, and any other permissible assets under the rules. The rules also set out the eligibility criteria for these funds and any requirements and conditions that need to be satisfied. Next on the lineup is the SEC rules on fixed income securities. This simply sets out the framework for registering such fixed income securities, including bonds, by governments, MDAs, and corporate bodies. We also have the NSIA Act that establishes the NSIA, that's the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. The NSIA is charged with the responsibility of developing the Nigerian infrastructure sector. And in order to do this, it's established the Nigerian Infrastructure Fund and is required to develop annually investment plans that will further this goal. We also have a number of other laws that touch on infrastructure financing, and I will just mention a few. First, we have the Road Infrastructure Development and Refurbishment Investment Tax Credit Scheme. Now, this ties into the point I mentioned earlier on fiscal incentives. By this scheme and under this order, the private sector investors are granted tax credits to reward their investments in infrastructure projects in Nigeria. We also have the CBN, who has developed and is developing a number of initiatives for real sector support, one of which is the CBN NEMSEF, that's the Nigerian Electricity Market Stabilization Facility. And it's noteworthy to mention that DTL actually advised the CBN in structuring this facility. We also have the Public Enterprises Act that sets a framework for the privatization of government assets and establishes the National Council on Privatization and the Bureau of Public Enterprises. We have the Public Procurement Act that establishes the Bureau of Public Procurement, which simply ensures accountability and transparency in procurement processes. In addition, there are a number of sector-specific laws on transportation that touch on concession and other forms of PPP models in relation to the different modes of transport in Nigeria. These include laws such as the Federal Highways Act, the National Railway Corporation Act, and so on. We have a regulation on the investment of pension fund assets, and this simply sets out form of investments that pension fund assets can be invested in, and any conditions that need to be satisfied for this purpose. To round off, there are also a number of bills that are currently being contemplated there in the works that once passed into law will impact on the infrastructure financing area. We have the Federal Roads Bill, which will seek to establish the Federal Roads Authority, and we have the National Roads Fund Bill of 2021. Having set the tone for our discussions today, I'd like to introduce John from EY, who will be giving a presentation on mobilizing finance for Nigeria's infrastructure development. John is currently a partner with EY Nigeria Strategy and Transactions Practice and the Energy and Infrastructure Leader for EY West Africa. John has over 20 years experience in enabling energy clients to maximize value from transactions by helping them with experience and deal advice, capturing value from strategy to execution. He has worked on over 100 transactions with a total deal value in excess of $30 billion. He's a thought leader on energy and infrastructure matters. He has spoken at several plenary sessions and written several publications on topical issues on the Nigeria energy value chain. He regularly provides insights in local and international media. Other than Nigeria, John has significant experience working in the energy markets in Houston, Texas, and Calgary, Alberta. He holds a master's in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Tufts University. He's also a member of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the AICPA. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to John for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Chizotam, and pleasure to be here. Thank you. Good morning, good day, good evening to our audience, wherever you may be in the world. I'll be walking you through the events or the factors that are affecting the way infrastructure is developed in Nigeria, and therefore how it impinges on impinges on financing for infrastructure. So, in looking at the infrastructure space in Nigeria, one cannot be surprised with indicators saying that Nigeria needs $100 billion annually for the next 30 years or so to bridge its infrastructure deficit. That should not come as a surprise to anyone, nor should it come as a surprise to anyone that the poor state of infrastructure has not only hobbled investment inflow into the country, but has the added effect of limiting the productivity of investments. So this is another way of saying that the level of investments in Nigeria is low due to the poor state of its infrastructure, but even the low level of investment it does receive are not impactful. To illustrate this point, Nigeria has an incremental capital ratio of 7.8, which is a measure of the degree of efficiency in the use of capital. And this compares to 3.5 in other African countries. We're showing that the level of investment in our economy, it's not driving the level of productivity or the impact that it should. And given that the role that infrastructure plays as an enabler of growth in our economy, it is then essential that adequate infrastructure is critical for Nigeria to obtaining significantly more output from the same unit of investment that it receives. And so mobilizing finance to develop adequate infrastructure becomes imperative, which then it's the thrust of our conversation today. So I'll move on to us looking at the mega trends that are characterizing the economic landscape and how these trends is changing the approach to infrastructure investment decisions and what levers can be pulled in mobilizing capital. We're seeing globally, but in Nigeria as well, higher densities in cities as people move from the rural area to cities. And the impact of that is it's changing the way infrastructure that is based on distributed assets, such as electricity, how it's being developed, making it to be closer to points of consumption. as in order to be more efficient and limit the losses that typically arises when electrons are having to be transported from far off areas. So with this trend, it means that there needs to be policy reform that should be put in place in order for the regulatory framework, and particularly in Nigeria, to be at pace with how infrastructure is now being developed. And in our local context, that means a deregulation and the knock-on effect of decentralization of the electricity grid, which would then be more responsive to this mega event, and also would then enable a change in the way we are currently financing infrastructure developments. In this case, in the electricity space. And another mega event that has impacted the way infrastructure is being developed is obviously rising population, Nigeria being the epicenter of this, with our population growing at 3% per year. With that, it brings a new imperative on how you traditionally will develop infrastructure, and then how you will finance it. It now requiring a lot more integrated approach in being able to finance infrastructure, rather than sometimes on a standalone approach that is typically employed. And that means now looking at other infrastructure enablers and looking at other sectors to converge in order to create almost a cross pollination of viability, if you will. So an example of this is how the Highway Development Management Initiative in Nigeria is being developed using the value-added concession, whereby the concessionaires are not only able to toll the roads, but have access to the right-of-ways in an effort to try to take a corridor approach in developing and enhancing the viability of the road network. So not only tolling the road and the revenue generation that comes from it, but also developing the right-of-ways that comes alongside, and ensuring that traffic and economic activity is stimulated, which in a way strengthens the viability of both the road itself by increasing traffic, as well as the adjacent areas that are part of the road corridor. So this integrated approach is increasingly being employed due to the rising population, and Nigeria, we are the epicenter of this. The other mega trend is energy transition, which for us as a fossil fuel economy had critical implications. And with that, again, like we mentioned, with electricity being largely consumed at the points of consumption, generated and consumed at the points of consumption, now means it further intensifies the need for deregulation of the sector, which would then also, given the preference and given the preference for financing to support clean energy and lower carbon energy sources, means then you by decentralizing the grid, you're able to easily incorporate diverse sources of energy into the energy mix. So with that, technology being very clearly very important, but the regulatory framework should enable and provide an avenue for such investments to even occur. And the last the mega trend that we've noticed is also aging infrastructure, which is really necessitating that a whole life cycle approach is taken in developing infrastructure to ensure that the cost of future maintenance is factored into the decision making and priced into the development of the project, so that the financing is appropriate. Now, in taking a look at in the local context, there are a number of value drivers that should inform the approach in the type of infrastructure that we should be focusing on, particularly because these value drivers have the potential effect of being very transformative and therefore high chances of viability. One being what we're seeing with the advent of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, providing an anchor for Nigeria to drive transformation into in agriculture, in power, and transport, and with increased integration of African countries into one common market. It enhances the market viability of Africa as a marketplace, while also making projects that are enablers to trade, such as trade carrying infrastructure, logistics, and trade enabling infrastructure, such as technology that makes trade processes easier, or even enabling infrastructure such as energy or special economic zones. So another local event that is also happening, not necessarily a local event, but we have in the transition to a knowledge economy, opportunities for infrastructure to be a key enabler here, and also in opening up markets that can make it easier for private capital to come in financing the technology that can allow, we all know that, we've all heard that 4 of the 5 unicorns in Africa are from Nigeria. And a lot of this is made on the successes of the telecom infrastructure, which was enabled by policies that was put in by successive administrations. So, and since then, we've seen the telecom space animating the interest of global knowledge partners, global technology companies in the Nigerian space, and essentially driving or mobilizing corporate finance transactions, which is a clear indicator of the confidence that capital sees in an economy when you do not use typical high-risk financing mechanisms such as project finance. So the knowledge economy continues to provide an avenue for Nigeria to develop its infrastructure, given the viability of that sector and the ease with which financing can be facilitated to help in further development of that sector. And largely, energy being the lifeblood of the economy, the need to use reform and regulatory reform to really mobilize capital to be able to operate in this space. There's the saying that capital is fleet-footed and would only go to locations where it is comfortable. So you cannot talk about mobilizing finance without setting the regulatory framework that would enable it or give confidence to investors to come in. Following on, if we look at the what are the areas that is being leveraged to drive capital into into infrastructure space. The PPP has always been a very popular method traditionally, and in Nigeria it has actually been used to drive investments in the port sector, for example, or even through policy drive investments into the telecom space, and continues to be an avenue for mobilizing private capital into the infrastructure space. Well, a big challenge in this area is often limited government resources coming against infrastructure needs and lack of capacity within the government to properly prepare projects that will pique the interest of investors, so to speak. So therefore, projects in this space that typically go through the PPP route often will require strong, which often comes via the development finance institutions and other multilateral institutions. But in this case, as we continue to find ways to make it easier to facilitate investments in developing infrastructure, there's a need for government to make the process much streamlined, to cut down the cost and the timelines it takes from 2 years to 6 months, and to create a strong framework that will allow, they'll create credibility in the process and also gain the confidence of investors. Another method that we're increasingly seeing is user-based funding. And as mentioned earlier, there's a roadway high bill that is being introduced in the Senate or making its way through the Senate. An example would be what exists in the US, for example, where surcharges on petrol and diesel consumption is used for road construction and transportation. And we've seen with the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act, a 5% levy being placed on the wholesale price of petroleum products, which would then go towards the funding, financing of infrastructure projects. And the sort of capacity that this helps, or the way it enhances the public sector's ability to invest in infrastructure, would even enable, would help crowd in private capital, because now government may be in a position to be able to properly prepare these projects and also properly provide a sort of credit enhancements or guarantees that may be needed to bring in private capital. Another source is obviously project finance, which is I would say the preferred way of financing infrastructure projects because of some of the de-risking mechanism that comes a part of it, in the sense that sponsors are not liable, and credit is based on the revenue generating capacity of the project itself. But it often requires, particularly where the government is an off-taker, and the credibility of government to be able to properly de-risk demand exposure often requires credit enhancements, which increasingly is becoming difficult, particularly in the Nigerian space, as we're seeing with the development of Azura, which project finance was the mechanism that was used to develop it. But some of the credit enhancements that were used to be able to get the project to reach financial close have made it difficult for other projects that were in the pipeline to crystallize. So as it comes with benefits, there are major challenges that needs to be looked at in looking at ways to continue to make it easy for financing to come into infrastructure development. Sector liberalization is a method that's used globally and has been used in the Nigerian context, particularly as it relates to the telecom space that I mentioned earlier, because then particularly when there is the market has reached a certain level of maturity, liberalization and the discipline that comes with when market forces are directing the action of market participants, it enables capital to be allocated more efficiently and creates a competitive marketplace, which then helps in facilitating more investments into that sector. Moving on. Just to move very quickly, I understand we are almost up. These are the key sources of financing infrastructure. We have the infrastructure funds, and you have companies like Infra Credit, the NSIA, Infra, which was recently set up. These companies tend to have specialized skill sets in developing infrastructure projects, and more typically tend to have products that helps in resolving one of the biggest challenge of financing in infrastructure, which is the availability of long-term currency debt. Increasingly, commercial banks are even coming into the infrastructure space despite their low appetite for this sort of risk. However, most of their finances that are long dated tends to be FX based and foreign currency based, and therefore has that currency risk associated with it. So the role that entities, some infrastructure funds and DFIs are doing in being able to provide long-term currency debt helps reduce the tenor mismatch that often inhibits the flow of capital, and also resolve the FX risk that also makes it difficult for infrastructure projects to be financed, particularly when the revenue is based on local currency. These are the considerations that ultimately will improve the conditions that will enable the facilitation of capital into infrastructure development. Everything that we've said just relies on having a proper policy and regulatory environment, because you cannot bootstrap yourself to infrastructure efficiency without dealing with these issues. And in our space, credit enhancements continue to be a big part of the infrastructure space, whether it comes in form of the sovereign risk guarantees that the world banks provide, or some of the guarantees that institutions such as Infra credit provides as well. And importantly as well, the whole life cycle costing is key to ensure that the financing when obtained is adequate to take on the whole life cycle of that infrastructure project from cradle to grave. So with this, I will stop my presentation and thank you for the opportunity. Let the discussions continue.
Thank you very much, John, for that very insightful presentation. We'll be going straight into the panel discussions to be moderated by Abiodun Oyeledu. Abiodun is a partner at Detail and is the head of our finance and capital markets team. And so I'll hand over to Abiodun to run us through the panels.
Thank you very much, Chizotam. And good morning, everybody. My name is Abiodun Oyeledu, as Chizotam mentioned. We're starting the panel session at 11:35. It's expected to last for 60 minutes with a Q&A session coming immediately after for 15 minutes. Some of the key questions that we'll seek to answer during the discussions on this panel session are, around the issues that have been raised by previous speakers with respect to accessing capital. How do you eventually unlock private sector financing, such as the pension funds, which have been reported to be in trillions? How do you unlock such capital into infrastructure financing? How do you drive down the cost of capital? And how do you bring in, long tenured financing into this space in view of the fact that infrastructure is a long-term asset, right? And we have a very super team of panelists, if I say so myself, who are going to be speaking to us around these issues. So please permit me to introduce our panelists. First off is Daniel Muller. Daniel is a versatile corporate finance professional with over 16 years hands-on experience in providing financial advisory services across the energy, infrastructure sectors in Nigeria and internationally, with previous experience at JP Morgan, Deloitte, and in Togo with the United States Peace Corps. He is the head of origination and structuring at Infra Credit, and Daniel holds a BSc in economics from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Daniel. Adalbi is an investment director at ARM Arrett. She is an infrastructure investment professional with over 16 years of experience in structuring bankable infrastructure projects, project development, and project management. She is highly skilled in negotiation and administration of power purchase agreements. And prior to joining ARM, she was the chief operating officer at Genesis Energy Group, where she drove the strategic expansion of its operations across Africa. Adalbi once led the origination and contract management team at NBET PLC. She's experienced in formulating and evaluating the impact of government policies in support of greater private sector participation in meeting infrastructure challenges. She holds both a BSc in electrical engineering and an MSc in electrical power systems analysis and design from Michigan Technological University. Good morning, Adalbi. Nosa is our third panelist, and he's a legal counsel at the Africa Finance Corporation, which is a DFI. And prior to joining AFC, Nosa was team lead in the banking, finance, and projects practice groups of a leading Nigerian full-service law firm. He's also had a stint at Afrexim, and he has over 10 years post-qualification experience advising and acting on local cross-border corporate finance, project development, and various transactions across different sectors. Nosa has been consistently ranked by leading foreign directories, which rank lawyers, including Legal 500 and IFLR. And our fourth panelist is Victor. Victor is currently the Deputy Managing Director with AfriInvest, and he supports the group's strategy and business development in his current capacity and provides senior oversight on the group's information technology, as well as finance, risk, and control functions. He continues to play a leading role in origination and execution of investment banking, drawing on his experience in corporate and project finance advisory, as well as capital raising. His project finance advisory experience includes providing advisory support to prospective investors during the private sector privatization process, as well as current investors for new projects in the energy sector. Since his move to AfriInvest, he's joined the financial advisory practice in the investment division in 2008 and has served as the head of AfriInvest investment research between 2009 and 2011, and asset management division as the pioneer managing director. And Victor graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in metallurgical and materials engineering from the University of Lagos and holds an MBA from IE Business School in Spain. Good morning, Victor, and welcome. And our last but not the least panelist is Dolu. Dolu is the Chief Investment Officer of Stanbic IBTC Infrastructure Fund and an executive of the Standard Bank Group. As Chief Investment Officer of the 100 billion Infrastructure Fund, he manages investment capital for a diverse base of alternative investors seeking exposure to the infrastructure asset class. And before transitioning into fund management, Dolu spent over 10 years as an investment banker at Stanbic IBTC Capital Limited, where he raised over $5 billion for corporate clients across different sectors of the economy. Prior to his career at Stanbic IBTC Holding, he was with Ernst & Young, LLP, providing transaction advisory services to clients in the financial services sector, automotive sector, and chemicals sector. Dolu holds a master's degree in business finance and international investments from Brandeis University, Boston, Massachusetts. And with that, I would like to welcome all my panelists on board, and we can get right into it. Good morning, everyone. So a lot has been said this morning by the two previous speakers who have spoken ahead of us, right? And I think the understanding is that yes, there is a huge deficit in infrastructure. Government is traditionally tasked with the responsibility to fund such deficits. But I think we all know that the government has been borrowing over the years, and it's not a sustainable approach. Therefore, the people with capital who should be investing in infrastructure assets includes the private sector. And if you look at the integrated infrastructure master plan, which my colleague had alluded to earlier, it envisages that a larger chunk of investments which will go into infrastructure will come from private sector or, from other government-enabled funds, or supported funds, right? As of 2020, I believe, pension funds are estimated to have 11.3 trillion, right, as assets under management. And there have been so many master plans so far as to how, we are going to develop this infrastructure space. And coupled with recent moves, such as, the government's announcement for concessions of roads, the setting up of Infrastructural, which we'll be speaking about a bit later, it becomes imperative that the discussion should move to how do we actually implement the current plans that we have available, so that we don't just have plans floating around. To start off the discussion, I will talk a bit about, or I'll ask a question, to my panelists around the issues so far before we go into recommendations. And perhaps at this point, I should also mention to our online audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. At the end of the panel session, we would then direct those questions to our panelists. Kindly also indicate which panel member you are directing your question to. And if it's nobody in particular or no specific panelist, we would try our best to allocate it to the person best suited to answer your question, right? And with all that being said, I think I will go straight to Nosa, I believe is there. Nosa's video seems to be off, so let me go straight to. Let me start with you, Victor. Right. So Victor, Nigeria has been touted as having, has been one of the countries targeted, to be looking to raise finance for infrastructure. Why would you say there's still a problem around infrastructure financing in Nigeria?
Thank you, everyone. Good morning, everyone, fellow panelists, and to the general public attending. I believe that question has been largely addressed in the very excellent presentation John made, which very clearly articulated a lot of the issues bedeviling infrastructure development and delivery in Nigeria. There are several factors responsible. First of all, there is issues around governance and framework. While certain states have tried to pioneer the issue of infrastructure finance, and I think Lagos is a prime example, there are not too many other examples. And even at the federal level, previous attempts at doing this, including, for example, the project, the MMA2, with the ancillary infrastructure around the hotel, the road project, Lagos Ibadan, and a few others, essentially met with different sorts of challenges. And then there's obviously an issue of perception, between the public, the citizenry, and participants in the market. I think it's a philosophical question, largely. On the one hand, citizens continue to question the rationale or the validity of the approach, which is leveraging private sector finance to drive infrastructure development. There continues to be an overbearing dependence on government and government balance sheet to fund these projects, notwithstanding the limitations that that itself poses. So there are several factors and a myriad of issues, including access to finance, more often than not, infrastructure projects, involve a foreign component, either with equipment or technology that requires, FX, purchases of payments, the continual challenges with devaluation, which in itself is a consequence of several factors, including just stuff as basic as inflation differentials. The Naira suffers, Nigeria suffers, long-term double-digit inflation against a US currency that is a lot more stable in terms of inflation. So there are several factors. I hope that during the course of this engagement, we'll be able to perhaps detail them in a bit more, in a bit more depth as we go along.
Thanks, Victor. Nasser, can I come to you now? Or do I skip you and come back? Okay, great. Daniel, I'll move over to you very quickly because Victor has touched on a few things, right? Around the issues for financing, governance issues, FX issues, Infra credit as an institution, and you are particularly, I think, best suited to answer this, being head of origination, right? What challenges would you say you're currently faced with in deal origination, and what structures would you think, could be put in place from both a government and private sector perspective to kind of de-risk projects you are looking at?
Thank you, Abiodun. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Thank you. And again, we appreciate this opportunity to engage with Detail and the other panelists. In originating and structuring infrastructure projects in Nigeria, I think we have to recognize a few factors, right? First is that we're actually very blessed in terms of resources and demand. So ordinarily, countries with this level of agricultural production, this level of demand, this size of population, there's an expectation that we should be able to sort this out ourselves, right, through an enabling environment of government, as well as the developers of the infrastructure projects themselves and the financiers. So when we struggle to do that and we start looking for external solutions and external financing, we actually start to complicate the matter, right? We start to make it look that that these are insurmountable challenges, that we don't have the money, or we don't have the demand, or there must be so much risk that we need government guarantees to make these projects work. So that's part of what we face, right, on the face of it. In reality, those credit institutions like ourselves that are trying to work through and support infrastructure developers, our challenge is the sort of minimal private sector track record in building, owning, and operating a lot of these assets. Most of the power plants are built by government. The roads were built by government. The ports were built by government. And so when you're trying to now move that to where it really belongs, is private sector operators taking the risk under either ownership arrangements or very long-term concessions, it's going to be indigenous companies, right, that are going to be these operators of these assets, but they don't necessarily have the track record. A lot of them, were maybe contractors on a government project. They've never actually owned and operated and managed, that port or that, free zone or that power plant. And so that's what we face as credit institutions as a first challenge. But we're starting to get past that. The ports have been largely privately operated for the last 15 years, power plants for the last 8. We're starting to be able to assess operators in their track record. And then it comes back to that enabling environment. What is inhibiting some of these operators from actually accessing the right type of financing to rehabilitate and grow these assets? And that speaks to how we interact with government. If an operator only has a 5-year license, you don't want to give him financing for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years because you're worried about what happens. What if his license doesn't get renewed by NERC or by by NPA or whoever is the regulator for that space. If there's constraints on what that operator can do. So maybe you operate a port or you have a concession to rehabilitate a port, but you're not allowed to do the dredging that's actually required to enable the vessels to come into your port. You're waiting on some government contract to do the dredging, or you want to do a power plant, but you're not allowed to sell directly to certain end customers. You have to evacuate via the transmission grid, which is government owned and operated, and you have to be paid by the bulk trader, which is again government owned. And if you could actually sell directly to end customers, you'd be great. You would actually not need the extra government guarantees, the extra supports and bailout. Oh, don't worry, central bank will come in and pay part of the power bills. So we have to always look at these interlinkages that constrain infrastructure, and it forces a lot of projects to end up starting smaller, because you're saying if I don't have assurance that I have adequate road infrastructure to evacuate my product, well then let me build my factory a lot smaller. If I cannot sell into the grid and know that I have access to end party, the end customer cash flows, well, let me just sell to this factory right here. Let me do a captive plant. And we end up with a lot of small projects that are direct to known end customers as opposed to proper infrastructure projects. And so again, it's about empowering these private sector infrastructure owners and operators to do more. They can build the gas pipeline if they need to. They can do the dredging if they need to. They can evacuate and sell directly to end customers, whether it's power or gas or whatever. And they have long-term views over their assets, 20-year licenses, 30-year concessions. It will only be revoked under extreme, non-performance standards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think if, I was going to summarize from what you've said, it seems there's a lot of dependency on government. And at some point, private sector needs to be involved in the entire value chain to make sure that some of these projects are actually bankable. That being said, the framework for developing these projects has to be there, because you'll be shocked that not all the states in Nigeria, for instance, can boast to have PPP laws. For instance, something that simple, could really limit the ability of investors to come in, or private sector to come in, right? So just flowing from that conversation, I'll move to Dolu, right? Dolu, from your experience managing an infrastructure fund, can I just, over and above everything that's been said, are there any risks that investors in your fund are averse to? Are there, certain type of infrastructure that they are a bit more interested in than others? If you could just give us your perspectives on that in terms of deal origination.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, or good morning, good afternoon actually, to the participants on this call, and thanks for the opportunity. I think the key points have been covered, and we can drill down into them, but I will take leading from the questions you posed. What are the risks that still remains, the residual risk that is being perceived by investors? In my experience thus far, the biggest is the political risk. The risk that the policies are not may not be sustained into the future. The risk that the government of the public sector part of the bargain may not be fulfilled. And if those parts are not fulfilled, it pretty much throws the project's economics into doubt. And so there's a lot of communication that needs to go from hile to hile, i.e. from the public sector to the private sector. And our role as fund managers is to kind of make that case that the public sector does mean well. They've realized that they can't do all of it. But when it comes to the risk of interference, the risk of not letting the market be the determinant of the economics of a project, it needs to be very clear that government will let market forces actually prevail. Of course, government has a role to play in making sure that the market doesn't run amok. While at the same time, investors going 10 years want to make sure that the projected return that they perceive and that has been communicated to them would crystallize, and it would crystallize in the absence of interference from the government. I would say that is the biggest risk in my interventions and experiences and interactions with investors, but it is surmountable. I think our role collectively and for a fora like this is to keep on passing that message across that with the right framework in place, we will be able to, in time, convince investors that in order for us to get the kind of return that they perceive, the best asset class is actually what it is we're talking about here. The opportunities has been pretty much highlighted at the beginning of this presentation. And I think because of time, it was actually a modest summary of what the opportunities are. The question is, how do we optimize it? And investors need to then see that there are practitioners and operators emerging in that sector to pretty much give the comfort that they're qualified enough to unlock the capital that would allow them to the returns to be delivered, even with the government risk and the political risk very duly mitigated. So I'll stop there, but those are the big risks, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Dolu. And that will be just picking up on what Dolu has mentioned around, political risk and all of that, right? Your fund has been around, for quite a while now. I believe you're one of the first infrastructure funds set up. And you were involved in perhaps one of the biggest project financings in the energy space, right? The power space. Are there any things, in broad terms that you would say experientially, you just want to tell us one or two things about deal origination, from your experience, lessons learned kind of perspective?
Thank you, Abiodun, and thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. From my perspective and our perspective, generally, there are a few things that come to mind. I think one very critical one is having sponsors who are sophisticated enough, understand what's required to bring the project to close, and are willing to do the work. So the recurring issue that we see is we have a lot of smart, technically oriented sponsors, but they don't fully get on the financing side what it would take to get a financial close. The other thing that we see is a lot of project finance tries to insulate the projects from the market, right? So you want your contracts to be end to end and the revenues guaranteed over the life. But from the project that you referenced, one of the challenges that you see is that you can have guarantees, right, that shows your revenue. But if you don't deal with the fundamental issue of the market itself, those guarantees will be under pressure, right? Because if you don't solve the underlying problem, right, the guarantees are only going to do so much before it becomes, an issue on the side of the guarantor. And then the other things are innovation. Innovation is very critical, right? So if you approach the problem the exact same way every time, and if you're starting to see that is not working, it's important to look at how else can that be done, right? So who else do we need to bring to the table to make this work? So I think just to summarize, we have many more participants right now in the infrastructure fund space. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a competitive market. It can actually be a collaborative market because different funds might have different focus or different interest. And it's actually possible that collaboratively you're actually able to achieve more.
Fantastic. I think I like the idea because there's a lot to invest in, so I don't think it's competitive at this point. And the more money that goes into infrastructure, it probably brings down the cost of financing eventually. But just, Nosa, are you available to speak now? Great. Just piggyback off what Adalbi has mentioned in terms of risks, underlying risks that are, that are affecting some of these projects. And one key thing that comes to mind is FX, right? I know you are with AFC now, and some of your investments are probably, FX denominations. So from your perspective, I'm going to ask two questions. First is, having been someone who's played in the market for a while, and then moved out and looking in, what are key things that are the risks from your perspective? And from an FX standpoint, how do you see that affecting financing?
All right, thank you very much, Abiodun, and to everyone on the panel and to everyone attending. Indeed, there are several risks that we tend to see in transactions in the market. I mean, when people say Africa is a country, it is indeed a country, because whatever issues you find, say in Nigeria, you find them in several other countries on the continent, even in the most advanced countries like South Africa. The FX issue is a very, 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 I mean, for Nigeria, it's a big issue. First things first, as mentioned by other members of the panel, we have a situation where we are borrowing actively for all sorts of things. And with the country borrowing so much, many times for recurrent matters, non-capital expenditure expenses, you find that there's so little that is able to achieve and bridge the infrastructure gap you have. And then what are we looking at? We are looking at getting funds from the private sector, from DFIs, from infrastructure funds, from all sorts of places. But really, do we have a system in place that really will incentivize these entities to actually bring their funds into Nigeria? You know for a fact that many people are, even in terms of private equity investments, they are reluctant to make these investments because you're not even sure of the circumstance under which you bring out that money. You're not even sure whether there'll be sufficient Forex to even deal with it, or if the government even prioritize your repayments at various times. And I mean, you think, oh, the CCI should resolve this, but no, you are going to join a long queue of several other lenders like you, several other investors like you, and it makes a mess of the whole system in terms of how investors view the Nigerian markets, with an official rate in quote of 412, 420, and black market rate of a parallel market rate of say around 560, 570. The question really is what's really, I mean, the Vice President recently was speaking about the difference, the divergence in rates. How do you exactly incentivize people to bring in the much needed private sector funds to get this done? We don't have the market for it at this point. If I were an investor trying to invest in a country like Nigeria, looking at the market, it's already an attractive market, a large market. If you're going to build a toll road in Lagos, for example, you have massive population to use it. But the question is, how do I get your repayment? How do we get repayments? Your receivables are going to be in Naira for most businesses, most projects in Nigeria. And if they're going to be in Naira, the question then is, how are you then able to get payments if you have these issues that remain unresolved and there appears to be no real political will to actually resolve them? So I think the Forex issue, like you mentioned, is very, very critical, which needs to be dealt with. Then, as mentioned earlier on, we have the issues around the political risk that we tend to see. I mean, when you do your, that's one serious impediment. Today the rules say this, tomorrow the rules say this, and it actually depends on who is asking for what and who is in power at any given time. So when you have such situations where the rules, even the same set of rules, can be applied in different ways. You find out that in many countries, including Nigeria, when you ask lawyers for opinions on certain points, there's the part of it where they tell you, oh, this is the law, and then this is the practice. And at times there's a divergence, and I'm wondering, why is that the case? And in fact, you find that today you are talking about a deal, and before the end of that period, even when the rules have not changed, you find that the market practice is changing. So you find that every time you want to discuss, so even when you're looking at the rules, you're looking at the laws directly, the lawyers are telling you, oh, let's go and engage with the regulator first of all. When you have such capricious application of rules and laws in any jurisdiction, no one wants to come there. It's then high risk. And of course, it means that anyone who's going to do it is going to charge a very serious premium to get to provide these funds to you. And if they have to charge a serious premium, it then affects the viability of the projects on many occasions. Then, of course, you also find things around lenders, around regulators or the government revoking. I mean, we did see this in 2007. You found the government revoking the sale of refineries that was done. I mean, whether or not it was a fair process or not, it was done. But these things send signals to the outside market. It sends signals to those people who are going to finance projects. So if I'm going to finance your acquisition of this project, if I'm going to finance your construction of this toll road, of these airports, of this railway line, of this whatever kind of project, of this refinery, if I'm going to finance it, what's the guarantee that we will not get to a point where the government revokes this concession to you? Afterwards, we're then looking for how to get compensation payments from the government, and then trying to enforce in all sorts of jurisdictions, amongst others. So that again is another issue, one regulatory issue that we have found. You also look at corruption.
No, sir. Can I just chip in there? And
yeah.
Just on the back of a few things you've mentioned, I would like to move quickly to Victor.
Okay.
Now,
okay.
Right, because I think it's a good point at which we should now switch to, the things that, Victor and his team and the other fund managers with, the newly established or soon to be established Infrastructural Corporation of Nigeria, right, are looking to do, in terms of your broad, or the promoters, broad objectives. How do these things solve all this myriad of issues that have been mentioned today?
Okay, thanks for that again. So I will be speaking, very carefully about Infracorp because, like you alluded, it's not yet in final form. There's still a bit of formation ongoing, and all that. However, the core objectives, from what we understood, having been part of the process to appoint asset managers, suggest that there are broad or overarching objectives, which include mobilizing local capital to begin to unlock infrastructure investment. More often than not, when we talk about infrastructure, we almost always sort of cede the room to foreign capital, or FDI as it were. So there's a need to begin to mobilize capital locally. And I think that point is one that has been highlighted by a number of players. One of the things we know usually is that even when we do have foreign investors coming into any market, they are looking to back project sponsors or promoters who are local, because typically there has to be some local knowledge of the market that provides that intelligence behind the deal structuring or project development. So that's number one. Number two, the idea is also to begin to think long term, which is to get a lot of the savings that are then begin to try and match those liabilities, as it were, with long-term assets, and to channel them into areas that begin to create the competitive advantages, or at least enable the competitive advantages that make Nigeria a more prolific market. A lot of the issues we face as a country with things like inflation, to my mind, are structural. And when we talk structural, we're essentially talking about infrastructure. our productive base, when I say productive base, I'm talking about manufacturing, trade and commerce, are essentially powered by inefficiencies across both the electricity generation, and transport sectors of the economy. Those two particularly speak to infrastructure. So we're talking power, we're talking transport. So whether it's roads or rail, we know that we can obviously all allude to the inefficiencies that are inherent in the market in terms of the quality of infrastructure or the lack thereof. And then there's also the issues around credible sponsors and promoters. Adobe actually did highlight the fact that there's a lot of very smart and intelligent promoters now. People are beginning to better understand what is required to do project development, which is to conceive, stitch together and lay out what is effectively a credible, bankable project. But then when we then come back and look at some of the broader issues, you recognize, like I think was Dude that mentioned, for example, the public sector and the biggest issues with Nigeria's infrastructure, which sort of speak to public sector risk. The promoters of Infra, with all due respect, are all institutions that are, to a large degree, I think for two of them, the NSI and the AFC are DFI multilateral institutions. And then, of course, the central bank, who is also a part of that club. By virtue of the relationships that they exert, it's possible that we can now begin to leverage the access to the executive and to government to begin to shape the thinking better, to understand what are the critical factors that enable infrastructure and long-term of these assets. On the one hand, the government, this particular administration, started out trying to bankroll investment from its balance sheet. But I think at some point it's become apparent that given the sort of ratios we're seeing for things like debt service to revenue, that strategy is not sustainable. There is a need to mobilize private sector investments into infrastructure, but in a way that is sustainable with counterparties that essentially are credible, understand the risk, and can deliver on projects. So all said and done, the goal is to start with local capital, with parties that are somewhat largely removed from government influence, which is why the Infra Corp itself set about appointing third-party independent private asset managers who have demonstrated at least an understanding and the capacity to do everything around project evaluation, dealing with pipeline development, do the risk analysis required to separate investments from one another, look at sectoral spread, look at timelines and horizon, and begin to take decisions that help begin to build that base that allows Nigeria to begin to essentially realize this potential that was long spoken about. I think at this point I'll pause so we can have a few others contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, great points, Victor. But I think that touches on political risks that have been mentioned, and insulating those risks through this initiative would probably go a long way to ensuring finances on law. And with that, Daniel, I just want to ask, being an institution who is already kind of set up to do something similar in terms of unlocking local currency financing into the space, right? Just from your experience, will you say so far you've been able to make an impact in that regard in terms of accessing longer financing? And if there are any, from your perspective, tools which would drive down the cost of capital and create that enabling environment?
All right, thank you, Abiodun. Yes, as far as our own track record and our corporate mission of facilitating access to long-term local currency debt finance for infrastructure, we believe we've been making an impact. We backed the first 10-year corporate infrastructure bond in 2017, and then the first 15-year bonds that were issued in the debt capital market by the private sector entities in 2019. And then this year we backed the first ever 20-year corporate infrastructure bond. And on the back of that track record of us providing the credit enhancement that protects the institutional investors like pension funds, they start getting more access to the infrastructure space. So they're not just buying government bonds, and they start to become familiar with the infrastructure sector, its risks, and maybe even demystify the sector so that they don't see risk everywhere. They actually see that these can be viable projects. And on the back of that, other companies start accessing the debt capital market even without credit enhancement. North-South Power issued a 10-year bond earlier this year. MTN is doing a 10-year. Ardova is in the market to do a 10-year. So we're starting to see that those longer tenured issuances generally, which is good, right? We want institutional investors to be able to diversify their portfolios. We want more companies to be able to access to debt capital markets, either with credit enhancement from ourselves or even on their own merits. And that's an important source of financing that wasn't necessarily that easily available before. Prior to 2017, most of the issuances in the debt capital market were maximum 5-year tenors, or you had some state government bonds, which are really not the same risk because the state bonds are backed by the debt management office, ensuring that the federal allocation funding is there to support the repayment. So we're starting to see the debt capital market evolve, which is great. But we will still need to work with government and work with entities like the Stanbic Fund, the Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund, Infracorp that should be coming up soon. These also are important partners, in the market that can help, because otherwise you're asking government to take, a lot of risk that maybe they're not ready to take. So if you're doing a toll road, maybe you want a minimum revenue guarantee from government. But if Infracorp is actually a co-developer of the project and they're willing to put in a certain level of funding, maybe government again doesn't have to provide quite as much assurance. And it's just we're trying to mitigate things that tend to go wrong. You start to build a project and then someone questions your right of way, right? Someone has to be moved off the site. You bring in equipment through the ports and you believe you have a customs waiver, and yet the equipment is held, and now you're paying money that you did not plan to pay just to avoid demurrage. And these sort of risks tend to pop up when you start to construct a new asset in a new location. And if Infracore, if other funds that are kind of sector specific, they know their space, they know what they're investing in. Africa Plus Partners also has their fund. The more that we have these sort of development, financing development partners, ARM Harith, Africa Finance Corporation, NSIA, there's a lot of different partners that can support the development, basically limiting the amount of demands on government. Because if NSIA is involved, or if Infracorp is involved, maybe they're confident that they won't have issues getting their equipment through the ports. Maybe they're confident that nobody's going to question their right of way when they start building that toll road. And that means, again, we're not asking for as much protection from government. And maybe those minimum revenue assurances are only for the first, 2-3 years until the project is fully up and running. And then government has really no risk. They're just reaping the reward of the economic development, the increased jobs, increased, pay and other taxes. So thank you.
Great. We're fast running out of time, so I'll just move to Dolu very quickly. A lot has been said about unlocking institutional investors' pockets and funds, just to touch briefly and see there's a large informal sector out there, right? How do you also tap into that market, right? So let's leave the pension funds alone for a minute. From an infrastructure fund perspective, are you also looking to tap into those sources of funds to develop infrastructure, as some other countries have done, where they have, long-term the national savings sort of initiatives, right? So it's just a question to get your thoughts.
Thank you. It's a good question. And my perspective is that regulation is very important. We're a country with laws, and there's a need for us as practitioners to collaborate with government, to collaborate with the trade groups, to form the right framework that allows that to happen. If you think back to 2005, when the Pension Act, as we now know it, was enacted, it's led in 15 years to a pool of capital eating 13 trillion naira, right? And that was because there was a framework. To access funding from the informal sector, you have to think about the issue of understanding of what it is you're deploying their capital into, to make sure that the participants within that sector understand that this is not like any other schemes that are out there. So it's fine to appreciate that there's capital in there, but we all need to work together to put up a framework of accessing it. And that's important. It's easy to identify that there's capital that is forming within the informal sector, galvanizing those capital, putting them to right use, providing the right understanding for those that are providing that capital is just as important. So looking at those capital base without necessarily thinking through what the structures would be is quite dangerous. There's also the things that we read in the newswire about abuse of the people or the participants within the informal sector, where people are springing up to take advantage and raising money and then losing money. And so framework has to be developed. Technology is not about, technology would enhance it, but even when we have technology without framework, it's a recipe for disaster in my personal view. But there's an opportunity there where, again, I come back to platforms like the discussions like this, turns the view of the regulators and all participants a little bit away from the institutional investors to the retail investors to say, how do we now harness this capital? How do we make sure that it's safe and put all the frameworks in place? And that is a process, that is a work stream that would take some time. It's already started, I have to say, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Thank you.
I agree. It started already. I'm sure you're aware of the SEC rules around crowdfunding and things like that. And there are all sorts of other pocket initiatives to tap into that informal sector. But I do agree with you that it needs to be well structured. I think the last question, I'll just want to go around the room to sort of get everybody's perspective, starting with Adelbi, if she's there. And if not, I would move perhaps to, okay, Adelbi is there, great. Just to get everyone's perspective, is what would be your final thoughts if you were to recommend or give recommendations on how to actually galvanize and push financing to infrastructure? What will be your final key thoughts as to what should be done in the immediate future to achieve this? Adelbi.
Thank you, Abiodun. I think, from a government's perspective, the Infrastructural is on the right path, right? I would say to add to that, there has to be some kind of prioritizing of government's needs in terms of what are we going to be putting commercial or private capital towards. It's not every part of the infrastructure project landscape that can be profitable. And so government needs to decide what does it want to finance using a commercial framework and what does it need to finance that it cannot use commercial frameworks for. And for those projects, we cannot set it aside. We're all here, private sector, so we're all focused on the things that can be profitable. But if you're looking at the broad landscape, government also has to think about how does it finance those parts of the value chain that is not profitable. And it might need to look at alternatives. So we see a lot of issues regarding flooding and displacement of people tied to climate impact, for example. Are we making a positive stance on what can be financed with climate capital that's being raised? The other thing that I would say is, we've said it a lot on this panel, policy consistency, regulatory consistency. You cannot raise financing for infrastructure if people cannot have certainty over the long term that whatever you're doing today is going to continue to be in place, at least for the life of the project. It cannot be overemphasized, so I'm going to emphasize it one more time. And then the last thing, I guess, is capital efficiency, right? So one, using more Naira for projects, I think that's critical, given that we've all talked about the FX risk that exists in the market. So raising more local financing, channeling that into infrastructure projects over the long term, I think that's very critical. And Daniel is, on the forefront of raising local capital, and a few other funds are raising Naira infrastructure funds. So really glad to hear that. Yeah, really that's it, getting more Naira into it. So even if you need to bring in dollars to get to close, then refinancing that as quickly as possible with local debt. Maybe if you can get the banks to be more comfortable with the projects, given that, construction risk, I guess, will be taken out of the picture at that point. Those are the kind of things that can work for financing infrastructure in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. Nosa, quick thoughts.
All right, thank you, Abiodun. I think a lot has been surmised by Adaobi. We need to really determine the direction we are going to go with our with financing projects on this part. We need to find a way, like she said, we need to determine what needs to be private sector and what needs to be government funded. And for those that need to be private sector funded or non-government funded, we need to incentivize and create the right environment for people to be able to bring their resources, their funds here, knowing full well that indeed returns, there will be returns, and that the projects will remain viable from day one up to the end of the financing, and even for longer. So those things are very critical. We need to, you have issues around even dispute settlement, for example, in Nigeria, and of course in many countries. Many investors are nervous about subjecting themselves to local courts, local arbitration, because at times a function of capacity, at times also a function of just blatant corruption. We need to find a way to fix these issues where people get comfortable being able to invest in your country. Your Forex regime is acceptable. Your legal framework is acceptable. The rules remain stable and they are not capriciously applied. They are applied uniformly across board. We need to find ways to work around even monitoring. I mean, one issue I found in some of the privatizations that were done, you had performance agreements that really most of our institutions don't even have the capacity to monitor the performance. Even when they have the capacity to monitor them, for some reasons, they are not properly monitored. So those issues have to be dealt with to incentivize investment, incentivize performance, long term, in the short term, in the medium term, and also in the long term ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think just to mention, just in addition to what Adaobi had said on funds, apart from even given the fact that we have very small local markets, our local banks may not be able to may not have capacity for some of the investments that we're looking at. A lot of the DFIs are also deciding then, because of the Forex issues, are deciding to do Naira bonds. You have Naira bonds by probably almost all the GFIs on the continent, or some form of Naira facility to ensure that you can then get local currency to finance projects without exposing the projects or the financiers or even the borrower to the Forex risk. Thank you.
Great, I think that's great to know. Dolu, can I come to you next?
Sure. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. Apologies for that. My final words are actually, or my final thoughts are two. To unlock sustainable capital over into the future. And the word for me, the key word is sustainability. We need to kind of think about, and this is addressed more to sponsors. We've dealt with the government side of things. we've dealt with, which includes regulation. We've dealt with the investor side of things, but what we've not dealt with is sponsors. From a sponsor group perspective, the idea that there are ways to avoid efficient markets to unlock long-term capital is a myth. You might have subsidized capital pool, but in the broader context of the macro environment that we exist in, those capital pool are for a short period of time and is hotly contested. Whoever gets, whether it's a subsidized for funding and all of that. The problem it creates is that the discipline that the sponsors need to have in project execution is further delayed when we're looking for handouts. The capital market is quite efficient and they're able to allocate resources once you've made your case. And so the earlier sponsors begin to access forums, capital markets to actually make their cases, interact with investors, the better it is for them to understand as a group what investors are looking at. And there's going to be an amalgamation of meeting of the minds. And into the future, that understanding gets deepened and it makes it easier. However, when we pack into areas where we're looking for subsidies, it will not, that project discipline will be far deferred. And I think it's an important point to make. The second point to make is, again, to project sponsors, is that whilst we always focus on the federal government, I think we all need to learn that there's capacity constraints in the ability to execute projects, in the ability to get resources for projects. We now need to kind of look at the subnational governments. There are opportunities across board, and sponsors need to be able to not wait for governments to say, this is what we want to do, as an example, but take ideas to the government and take a complete funding solutions to the government. As daunting as that seems, what it would do is that it allows sponsors to engage all of us on this panel to actually put cases together at a project level and take it to government to say, hands off, give us a 30-year concession. We have all the things that we need. We just want the rights and the enabling laws that would allow us to do what we need to do. The more sponsors begin to think along those lines, we will not be waiting to ask for government budget and be bidding for contracts. Rather, we're taking the conversation a level higher, where we're taking solutions to government and telling them to keep their money for the social issues, where we're able to structure the right transactions for projects. So those would be my final thoughts, specifically addressed to sponsors. Thank you.
Thanks, Dolu. Daniel, I saw you nodding along as Dolu was speaking, because I think that speaks to a lot of your concerns that you raised earlier around dependency on government. But just wondering if you had any other final thoughts on this.
Yeah, again, and I think you started the session, you mentioned the 11.3 trillion naira that the pension funds have under management. And that's a big advantage that Nigeria has over a lot of other developing countries. We have a more developed debt capital market. We have a more developed private pension industry. And again, we have the demand and the resources. So we really need to believe in ourselves and get the projects done, get them structured, continue to engage with government. And on the pension side, it's really about continuing to demonstrate that this is great for them, right? When we back new infrastructure projects that will boost our economic development, it will create more jobs, it will pull more people out of the informal economy and into the formal economy. And that's what they want to see, because then they know their pension contributions are growing. So if you have a new port business, you know that there are employees that are going to be in that port, and they're going to be more contributors to the pension industry. And that, we'll be talking about 40 trillion naira in a few years. This is all tied together. Thank you.
Thanks. And last but not the least, Victor.
Okay. I think I would just like to draw on the point that I think Nell highlighted earlier, which is on collaboration. I think for infrastructure, the mindset has to shift from that of competition to collaboration. I'm quite excited that there is already some of that beginning to take place. Daniel mentioned a couple of other funds or participants who have begun to collaborate across projects to begin to unlock infrastructure. And I think for the whole end of the value chain, there are different segments where participants could play. An example is, for example, the Africa Plus Fund managed by Africa Plus Partners that I know already looks at very early stage projects with a very shallow J curve. These are projects that are sort of 12 months or maybe maximum 15 months to execute. Low budget, or should I say mid-cap type projects. And they've taken that early stage part of it, including mostly equity financing and all the ancillary structuring that could happen to work with developers to de-risk projects at the early stage. And then further down the chain, you can then talk about the more larger scale projects and timelines. So that's the first point. And I think more importantly is to sort of underscore the very important point that Lulu made about project sponsors or promoters. I think there has to be a lot more deliberate effort by project promoters to think, beyond, government as a source of both licenses or concessions as well as finance, and become more creative and perhaps work with quality advisors to put together projects that are better packaged, better structured, with a lot of thoughts given to things around risk mitigation, things around timelines and structuring, as well as exit. It's important that as the market we begin to demonstrate a commitment, and I think for the public sector, those who are close enough to begin to explain to government about why it is critical that policy is that policy consistency, the legal and the sort of judicial system needs to be strengthened. I think that's one area that doesn't get mentioned a lot, but it's extremely important to give comfort and confidence to investors, because where there are disputes, where there are disagreements, a divergence of opinion, a change of track, if there's a lack of confidence in the local legal system to remedy or to provide succor to aggrieved parties, then we will continue to struggle long term.
Very well said, Victor. I think that's where the legal terrain is where lawyers and the judiciary come into play. But unfortunately, sometimes we are unable to give clear views, as Nosa had mentioned earlier, because sometimes there are discrepancies in the laws itself, right? You could have discrepancies between the ICRC Act, and the procurement laws of certain states. So sometimes those things don't permit, giving a clear opinion as some foreign investors or even local funders would want. With that said, we've come to the end of the panel session, but I will go into the Q&A box to take questions from our audience. And the first question I see here is for Daniel. Daniel? Yes, so there's a question for you here, Daniel, and says, healthcare in Nigeria is attracting more attention, and would InfraCredit provide a guarantee to ring-fence healthcare debt long-term financing, and under what sort of conditions?
Okay, and I think I've responded already on the text, but yes, healthcare is certainly an infrastructure sector. It can have long-term sustainable cash flows if structured correctly. So we classify that as social infrastructure, where we have healthcare, affordable housing, education. Challenges with healthcare funding are typically that, especially for hospitals, you typically do not have contractual offtake like you might have for a power plant or a gas plant, or even an agriculture processing facility. You really have to establish a track record that my cash flows are predictable, my revenue is predictable, and that can be hard to do, right? So it's difficult for a credit institution to take greenfield risk that a hospital is actually going to meet the revenue targets from inception. So you definitely need other financing partners, developers to build it and get it in place. And then we will all look at it as sort of lenders and credit institutions to say, okay, this is doing well. I will refinance a portion of your development debt with a 15-year corporate infrastructure bond. Now, healthcare isn't only hospitals. It's a little bit easier to do equipment financing. So one should very easily be able to work with a state government that has 100 healthcare facilities and say, we're going to bring equipment into all these facilities, and here's the private sector operator that's going to manage that equipment for the next 10 years. That's something that is easier to back, and that can be a mix of private and public facilities. But then you start to spread your risk around many healthcare facilities, because we all know, I mean, most people on this call, we're in the formal economy. A lot of us have our HMOs. We know that if we have a bad experience at one hospital, we will just switch to another hospital within our HMO network. And so if you're a credit institution, that's scary, because you're saying, well, wait a minute, one accident at that hospital and all their demand will be gone, right? The minister's wife has a bad experience there. The governor's son has a bad experience. Right or wrong, your demand can dry up at that. So you don't. So it's difficult to back one facility. It's easier to back dozens of facilities. Put the equipment in there. If one hospital's underperforming, I can move that equipment somewhere else. But yeah, these are some of the things we've looked at, as well as sort of pharmaceutical production. Pre-COVID, one would have just classified drug production as consumer goods, not infrastructure. COVID made a rethink that, wait a minute, we need to be able to produce things locally. We can't be dependent on international supply chains. So that's another area that can be classified as healthcare infrastructure, is actually essential drug production locally. And the question there is, can we backward integrate into the raw material supply? Because a lot of the raw material supply is actually imported, and then you're dealing with the same FX issues, the same customs duties and port efficiency. So that's another question. But all of this can be backed if we can show that it's long-term, predictable, sustainable.
Thanks, Daniel. I have a question for Victor, which seems to be two-pronged. I think the first question seems to be, how does the role of the NSIA differ from the newly created Infraco? And also there's a question on whether or not, the multiplicity of financing sources would crowd out private capital participation. I think that the second one is pretty easy to answer, because I don't think it's meant to crowd it out, it's meant to enable it. But Victor.
Okay, so starting with the first, I think what is clear is the enabling law that set up the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the NSI, specified basically savings as its core objective. I know that the NSI is organized and operates through 3 funds, one of which essentially tries to play in infrastructure. But the overarching objective is really to preserve, the wealth of the country through savings. Now, in terms of how much is allocated to the infrastructure fund amongst its 3 funds, and whether or not there has been a significant contribution to its overall purse by the executive over time, is a question that needs to be answered. And I reckon that in looking at its operations, its capacity to undertake projects, it has probably realized that, given maybe staff strength, I'm not sure what the number is, it perhaps is not well suited to embarking on significant large-scale infrastructure project financing, just again due to constraints in human capacity, internal resources. And I reckon that is perhaps why it has, in partnership with the Africa Finance Corporation (AFC) and the central bank, essentially co-developed the idea of an infrastructure corporation, which institution that is only remit is really funding infrastructure projects. And I believe that with 4 asset managers in the mix, whose responsibilities will span, project, origination to appraisal to investment decision making, and of course monitoring over time, and that that particular framework would be better suited to essentially driving infrastructure financing, with the NSIA then being essentially an investor through that structure. The second question that talked about, crowding out private sector. I'm not sure if it's participation or private sector access to project financing. I'm not quite sure that is the right interpretation or the right understanding of what this is supposed to achieve. If anything, Daniel mentioned, for example, the amount of capital that sits with the pension funds and the depth of the local debt markets that have evolved since 2004, when it was essentially structured and set up. To my mind, I believe quite strongly that what we will see is increasingly greater participation by local pension funds as the quality, as the profile, as the sheer number and scale of the projects that are now going to be presented begin to deepen with the onset of Infrastructural. Clearly, the biggest concerns with the pension or by the pension industry is preservation of retiree funds. You don't want to create a problem with an ALM mismatch, asset liability mismatch. All the pension funds essentially have a liability that is essentially payouts that are required to be made sometime in future for contributors. And one thing you don't want is to lose a part of that fund, therefore creating pressure on the liabilities when and if they do mature further down the line. And so what we need to do today is create an avenue where we can begin to better match assets in terms of duration and tenure to the profile of the assets under management. My sense is that a lot of the funds today being managed by pension funds sits within the, I think, funds 1 and 2, which is largely skewed towards younger contributors who are probably 35 or under, people whose expected useful productive life is another 15 to 20, perhaps even more, 25 years of being in productive employment. And therefore, if some actuarial valuation is done that tries to profile these individuals and their life expectancy and when they will begin to expect to draw on the contributions, there is still some 15, 20 years down the line. And therefore, under that construct, can we not create assets that are able to then take some of those contributions and match them to infrastructure projects that can then better deliver value to the broader economy? Daniel eloquently talked about the impact of properly structured, well-funded infrastructure projects in terms of what it does for local employment generation, for moving people into the formal economy, where under better structured salary arrangements, you ensure that you can begin to further expand the pool of contributors into the pension pool, and we hopefully create a virtuous cycle that continues to expand the pool, expand contributions to the fund, while at the same time delivering infrastructure to better unlock the economic fortunes of the country. Thank you.
Yeah, well said, Victor. Well said. I have a question here around infra fund managers. I'll direct it to either Dolu or Adelbi, whoever jumps in front of the gun. It says blockchain applications have gone mainstream globally, and in Nigeria, shouldn't local private infrastructure fund managers be leading the promotion of all industries connected with blockchain infrastructure, no matter the attitude of regulators? So I guess this is a question around ICT, and if it's an area, fund managers are looking at in terms of infrastructure, particularly, I guess, around, the things happening in the blockchain space, and, So Dolu or Adobe, whoever.
Okay, I can take a bit of this. For me, the question about blockchain is in its use, right? Today, the most broad use for blockchain is in on finance, money transfers, and because by its very nature, you don't know who's doing what transactions, it poses a lot of risks, right, to the financial systems, which is why it's unlikely to get broad acceptance from a policy side or a government side. But I believe that if we expand the applications of blockchain, we might actually find situations where you can raise financing for that. An example is land records, for example. You know that one of the challenges that we face here in Nigeria and some other countries is you don't know who the true owner of a particular parcel of land is. It can have been sold multiple times, multiple people. But if you can apply blockchain to that, for example, you know that there's one owner on the chain, right? And that owner has to be the person who's selling it. So it's thinking around that, taking the underlying technology, finding applicable applications for it that are acceptable on a broader basis, both on the policy and regulatory side, as well as for use, then you might be able to then raise financing for that much easier.
Thank you, Adelobi. I have a question here for Nosa. I'm not sure how much you may be able to access to this, but I'll go ahead and ask anyway. It says, what's the quickest source of Forex to import critical infrastructural equipment? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know you're not the CBN, but
okay, probably. I think there are several sources to get your Forex to import. I think your cheapest source of importing Forex is the CBN, as things are right now, or going through the official channels, going through an authorized dealer to get it at the official rate, because doing otherwise will mean that you'll be getting it at a lot more expensive rates. Or maybe you go to a DFI or a commercial bank willing to give you a dollar facility, but then you then run the risk of what are your receivables? Are they in Naira? If they are Naira, they get exposed to the Forex foreign exchange risk, which of course begins to affect your ability to repay the facility. So thank you.
Thanks, Nosa. Daniel, one more question for you, which says, can Infra Credit guarantee a capital raise offering for a fintech? Would that be something you would, look at?
Yeah, fintech. I think we have to classify it as sort of a disruptive technology, right? A new innovation, and so it has to be really well understood. So we've looked at what we call payments infrastructure, right? Technology that backs most of the POS devices in the country. That's something that one can establish a track record and show that they have a sizable market share and predictable cash flows. So fintech general, again, it's not an asset heavy sector or subsector. So one has to really believe in the long-term, sustainability of that business, that one operator that you back today won't just be disrupted by another operator, 2 or 3 years down the line who has a slightly better product. And that just goes for anything that's new, anything that's disruptive, anything that's technology heavy. There's just less predictability. So it's a lot more difficult, I would say. Unless someone is, again, if they're the market leader, if they're showing that they have track record, sustainable cash flows in Nigeria, because it's not enough to just have done it in Kenya or somewhere. You have to be here, and you have to be succeeding here, and then you start to be able to access that. But again, it's hard if you don't own the assets, but it's not impossible. Sometimes in the infrastructure space, you only have a concession and you don't own the assets, maybe for a toll road or a hydropower plant or something. So not every business has to have, hard assets, but it is a tricky space. And I think you need specialized institutions who really understand that subsector to sell it to the credit institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think with that, because we are fast running out of time, if there are any other additional questions sent in, we'll try our best to, respond, and perhaps you can send us a direct message. We are social, and I think you have our contact information in the slides that will be sent to you as well. And that being said, I would like to thank every single participant who's logged in today. Thank you very much. The presentations will be available on our YouTube pages and on our social media pages as the days progress. I would also like to say a very heartfelt thank you to each member of our panel and the presenter who spoke earlier from EY. We appreciate that you took the time out from your busy schedules to come and, rub minds with us today, because this is a very important topic, particularly in light of, the recent pandemic and what have you, which makes you realize that, borders could be closed anytime, right? So you may be trapped within your own country. And if you do not have the infrastructure, or you don't have access to healthcare or whatever, right? You would be in a bad place if you have not invested in yourself. So it's very topical at the moment to make sure that infrastructure is at the top of our minds, and financing that infrastructure is also equally important. And that said, thank you very much to Daniel, Dolu, Nosa, Victor, and a special heartfelt thank you to Adele. And have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.